This is mLBC, leading MHoC's conversation. The Twistednuke Show. Good afternoon, everybody. Now, on Monday, the government authorised a series of airstrikes to be taken in cooperation with the American and French governments. These were targeted at a chemical weapons research and development facility in Baza and two facilities in Himshinsha, and all three targets were successfully destroyed. LeafyEmerald has said these targets and strikes were intended to weaken the Assad regime's ability to deploy future chemical attacks. But he's been landed in hot water. The strikes were performed without a parliamentary vote to give assent to them. And while this is in itself not illegal, the Prime Minister promised the Viscount of Stangate to Phoenophon at Prime Minister's questions only days before that the House would be consulted if military action were to occur in Syria or anywhere else. As such, Mr Emerald has come under fire for apparently going back on his word only days after giving assurance to the Viscount at PMQs. And this only adds to further hot water, as Parliament has already voted on whether to intervene in Syria in 2016 and voted against it. So tonight I want to discuss Syria and these strikes. Were these strikes the correct response to the chemical weapons crisis? And how do we deal with the situation in Syria over the long term? And should Leafy have asked Parliament first? Maybe you think Leafy has handled this well, and that we needed to punish Assad for chemical attacks. Or maybe you think Leafy should have called for an emergency debate to ensure Parliament backed him in his intervention. Or perhaps you're sceptical of the whole thing, and you think that Assad didn't do it. Our first caller for this afternoon will be Jeffrey from Belfast. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Twisted.
So, what's your take?
Frankly, I think the Prime Minister has overstepped here. I think he most certainly should have consulted Parliament, or at the very least his own cabinet, before this. And I believe that we should have done more investigation to whether or not Assad had actually used chemical weapons in that area of Syria, or might as well have just been the Russians supplying the weapons for the means of, or giving the Assad the means to fire these weapons on rebels or his own people.
So, to play devil's advocate, what if we assume that consulting Parliament and the necessary delays in that would have enabled Assad to move stockpiles? Because if the intention was to eliminate potential vectors for attack and manufacture of chemical weapons, which the Americans have assessed to be somewhat effective. They do believe that stockpiles have been kept elsewhere, but it's believed to have had some effect. Then wouldn't it have been the case that they simply could have moved all of their stockpiles and resources out of those facilities before the airstrikes occurred?
Well, I'd like to think our Prime Minister is much less volatile than the current United States President, and isn't as trigger happy as the rest of them.
How should we deal with Syria then, and how do we deal with these chemical attacks? What's the proper response in your view?
I believe we should be supplying aid to the rebel forces, as they're the ones fighting for proper democracy in Syria, and as Britain, as Britons everywhere, we should be fighting for democracy wherever we can. And we should also be condemning Russia for supplying Syria possibly with chemical weapons and missiles to shoot at rebel and civilian targets rather than aiming for the real threat of the Islamic State.
Well, there's some interesting points there, but I think we've had a checkered past of backing rebel groups, and generally we tend to find out that as soon as we supply rebel groups with weapons, then they tend to end up in the hands of people we don't want them to have, and we tend to end up getting shot at by our own weapons. And if you look at say Libya, we backed rebel groups there. Libya has gone from the most successful country in Africa to a basket case.
As in supplying the rebels, I meant more like humanitarian aid to affected families who have been bombed and forced out of their homes, who are fighting for the rebel cause. We could be sending humanitarian aid elsewhere as well.
Okay, so specifically Syria. Targeting aid at the rebel groups.
Yes.
Okay. That's an interesting proposal, but wouldn't we make the situation somewhat worse, because it's already a degree of a proxy war? And by supplying aid only to rebel groups, wouldn't we only worsen that?
Well, this has only turned into a proxy war due to the United States and Russia trying to get involved. It's not Britain's business to be really trying our hand in military might with the United States, because it's just going to land us in a much larger conflict that none of us want to be a part of.
So should we be trying to withdraw from the Syrian situation and sort of let it sort itself out?
We should stop trying to be militarily involved in the Syrian situation much more humanitarianly, or in a much more humanitarian stance.
Okay, well, thank you for your thoughts. Next, I'm going to go to David from Manchester. David, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So what's your take on Jeffrey's points?
Well, I believe as a patriotic Brit, we should intervene in these places because we should be world police. Okay. America has taken it back a notch and we should take it up a notch. We should be putting our troops in Syria and getting rid of Bashar al-Assad, and we should be getting rid of Vladimir's troops. And yeah.
Well, how do we deal with the fact that the Syrian government and Assad are effectively Russian-backed and sort of the Russian proxy in the area?
Well, we deal with it with our Navy and Air Force and troops.
Well, aren't the stakes too high here to simply intervene militarily? Because we've been down sort of a Cold War-esque path for some time, and do we really want to go back to the days of sending off our troops to somewhere simply because the then Soviet Union had done the same?
Yes, we should do. We should deal with the Russians and the Syrians right now, immediately. And this nonsense, they've done it 70 times now, is it? So let's just go out there and kill them. Let's just annihilate them, be out before Christmas.
Well, David, I'm going to have to let you go, but you're a much braver man than I am. Alan, in Malden, what do you think?
Oh, hello, Twisted. I support the government. I think we should, it sends a clear message that chemical weapons aren't tolerated in warfare. And I think that if the Prime Minister waited for parliamentary approval, that the chemical weapons would have been moved to another facility and the strike would have been worthless.
Yes. However, the Americans have released a report where they assessed the likely impact of these strikes. And they concluded that the impact would be there, but quite limited, because the Assad regime are believed to stockpile their chemical weapons in civilian areas. So they stockpile them in schools, in hospitals. That way they're very hard to eliminate through conventional strikes.
Well, I just think it sends a message to the to future leaders that if you use chemical weapons against civilians, then you will be and you will face military action from the United States and France and Britain.
But do you think it needs to go further, and that the UN or at least the Security Council needs to operate together here?
Well, it would be nice if the Security Council could operate together, but as we've seen, Russian obstructionism has meant that the Security Council is paralysed at the moment. So I think that the action from the United States and Britain and France was the only one that we could take.
Okay, so you back the short-term solution, but how do we deal with this problem over the extended longer term? Because this might be a potential solution for the short term. It's very hard to tell. But how do we deal with Syria over the long term? And how do we deal with the fact that the Russians aren't going to simply allow us to remove Assad?
Well, I disagree with the previous callers. I think that Assad has essentially won the war already. He controls a majority of the territory and is looking to crush the other remaining rebel strongholds. So I think at the best, what we can do is just hope that we can help as many civilians as possible and make sure that the Syria after the war doesn't fall into humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, we certainly did see that in Libya when we intervened. Intervention isn't necessarily always the best option. Now, should Leafy have gone to Parliament first? I know you touched on this earlier, but like, should any other measures of assent be taken?
Well, if the government plans further military action, I think they should go to Parliament. But I think the situation required urgency, and Parliament can act in time to get the permission needed for the strikes.
And what do you think of people like the MP Contraband, the MC, who felt that Parliament should have been consulted, there should have been a vote held before any airstrikes occurred?
Well, I just don't think he lives in the real world. He's just out of touch with reality. He thinks that we had time to authorise the strikes, but as time has shown, we didn't have time. So he's just wrong.
All right. One more question before I let you go. Do you think that these strikes will be effective in stopping future chemical attacks, or do you think they'll only really function as a deterrent? So in terms of practical terms, is it now harder for Assad to strike?
Well, I certainly hope that they dissuade future leaders from using chemical weapons, but if they don't, we can just strike them again.
Okay, well, that's certainly one option. I think we could get into very messy territory if we have repeated airstrikes, but thank you, Alan. My next caller will be Adam from Sheffield. Adam, good afternoon.
Hello.
What do you make of the conversation so far?
Oh, well, I think it's a very interesting point to make. I think some people have made some very interesting points so far. I mean, my take on it is we voted Brexit so we wouldn't be bossed around by these countries, these so-called global powers like Syria and Russia, who are killing kids and they're launching chemical weapons in our own country. We need to take it back. We need to make a statement that it's not right. My granddad fought in the Second World War for this country. He flew in a Spitfire and he dropped bombs on evil Nazis in Germany. I think we need to do the same to the Syrians, because that Assad is killing kids. He's not a good man. He's not like the old leaders back in my day. We voted Brexit to take back control, and let's be honest, we're going to have to take back control of the Middle East, because the British Empire, when we held that region, everything was beautiful. We had beautiful buildings, we had beautiful colonies, we had all the trade in the world. We were the world's oyster, and to be honest with you, ever since we've curved the British Empire, we've looked weak. And for me, I think the fact that we haven't put boots on the ground in Syria, and we've already tried to bomb them, for me, I just think that's an entirely stupid thing on LeafyEmerald's part. He should grow a backbone. He should get troops in there.
Well, that's certainly one interesting response. Now, when the troops are there, who are they fighting for, in your view? Are they fighting for the rebel groups? Are they fighting against certain rebel groups? Whose side are they on, basically?
Well, I'd say they're on the side of the NATO task force that should be entering, because, let's be honest, the last few years, NATO have done bugger all for us. With Iraq, they turned the back on us, the French and everybody. With Afghanistan, they went in, but then they pulled out when the going got tough. We've had to lead everything, just the US and us. And let's be honest, I'm getting sick and tired of it just being us leading it. I think we need to do it for NATO. We need to help install a liberal democracy in that country. And for me, I just think we've got to make it. We've got to make it what it was.
So, would we be fighting on the side of the moderate rebels then?
Yeah, that'll be the idea. I mean, there's a lot of rebels out there where I'm not a big fan of, like the Kurds and that. I mean, for me, I just think they're adding more fuel to the fire. I think that we also be kind of Islamic State because they've launched attacks in our own country. I mean, for me, it's just a case of we've got to. People say, "Oh, we shouldn't be the world's police," but when haven't we been? We were the British Empire. We were the big, strong lads who fought in the Opium Wars. And for me, I just think it's got to be like that again.
And so once we've set up this liberal democracy there, how do we avoid it ending up like Libya? Libya deteriorated massively after we backed the rebels, and it's, as I say, it's gone from the richest country in Africa to a complete basket case.
Well, my view is that we keep troops in there for as long as possible. Like we did with Germany. We keep troops in Syria. We keep them knocking about, make sure nothing kicks off. And once we can be sure it's a proper democracy, we get ourselves out of there. We leave them to it.
Well, that is certainly one approach. I'm not sure I agree, but it's interesting to hear your opinion, Adam. Thank you very much. My next caller will be Magnus from Worcestershire.
Hello, Twistednuke.
Hello.
It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Oh, you're charming. I'd have you again. What would you like to talk about?
I would like to say I've never been more proud to be British. Mr. Emerald has done a magnificent thing, and we should have done this years ago.
I see. And do you think he should have gone further?
I think this was enough. I think enough to stop Assad from doing this again. And I think we should have done it in 2013 when he did it the first time. We should have done it last year when he did it again. And we were right to do it this time.
So where do we go from here? How do we deal with the situation in Syria?
I think we need to do more like this, bombing his military installations, crippling his ability to do this again. I don't agree with other callers that we should send troops in. I think that they are maybe living in a different reality, but because we can only make things worse. But I think by destroying Assad's ability to do things like this again, then we can show that we will always stand up for the international norm that chemical weapon use is not allowed.
Okay, and how do we deal with Russia and their influence in Syria?
Well,
because they're going to, I expect, make things very difficult. However, we want to progress from here.
They're going to make things difficult either way. We might as well do the right thing and make the Russians be difficult towards us, because they're going to do it anyway. It's not going to make a difference.
Okay, and do we keep Assad in power, or does he need to go?
Well, I think that's going to depend on the course of the war. I don't think we should send troops in to depose him. I don't think that would make the situation better. But I think providing the support to the rebels by bombing his military installations and by ensuring he can't do things like this again, then I think that they will do it from the bottom up. And I'm sure that will lead to a much more stable country than when we went into Iraq or Libya.
Well, if you look at the situation in Syria now, Assad's basically won.
Well, exactly.
The rebels are doing very poorly, so I'm not convinced that simply bombing would ever be enough. If we want to secure a rebel victory, I think we'd have to put troops on the ground.
Well, I think that's because we've not been doing any bombing. We've only been bombing ISIS. Well, we haven't been doing anything against Assad because our lily-livered parliament has done nothing about it. They've been too busy worrying about their pacifist voters.
So what is the long-term solution in Syria, in your view, then?
Well, we need to do more like this. We have to stand up for international norms. We have to stand up for humanitarianism. And I think if LeafyEmerald carries on like this, he will have my vote again at the next general election.
Well, Leafy, if you're listening, there you go. You have the vote of this fine gentleman, Magnus from Worcestershire. Thank you very much, Magnus.
Thank you, Twisted.
Our next caller will be Alex from Edinburgh. Alex, good afternoon.
Hello there.
Well, what's your take on this discussion and the situation in Syria as a whole?
Well, generally, I have to admit that I'm not a big fan of having airstrikes. I feel that for too long we've acted as the world's police, and we've never had the desired effect. I go back to when we went into Iraq on lies about weapons of mass destruction. I remember we went into Iraq for a war on terror when really it was a war on oil. And personally, I just think that we're the sort of country who tend to get involved too much if the Americans say so, and I don't think that that's the route we should be taking. We should be looking to, for me, I think we should be looking to arm rebel groups like the Kurdish rebels such as Tequila, and we should be trying our best to ensure that the region is stable, but not destabilised by our efforts.
And if we arm the rebels, how do we end up avoiding the situation where in 20 years' time our our troops or our allies' troops are being blown up with IEDs we gave to the rebels and being shot at by guns we gave to the rebels?
Well, I think the thing is you've got to have a degree of trust there, because I think when you look at our previous interventions, we've gone with the wrong government almost. With Iraq, we went with a very unstable, non-secular government which didn't introduce the type of democracy we were expecting. With Libya, we just really didn't do anything. Went in there, we bombed, and we went back out. With Afghanistan, we really didn't take out the Taliban threat, despite saying we had, and as such, that didn't work out. So for me, I think if you're arming rebels, you've got to make sure it's the sort of rebels who want a secular democracy. The Kurdish rebels want it. Some of the moderate rebels want it, and for me, I think you've got to look at specific rebel groups and act from there.
Can the rebels succeed in creating the kind of liberal democracy we'd hope to see in Syria? Because we know there are radicals within the main bloc of the rebels, not just within ISIS. And we know that generally militarised forces are quite bad at creating demilitarised governments.
Well, the thing is, you've got to have a lot of trust there. Now, to use an example, which is a totally different scenario, but Northern Ireland following the Troubles, you had the UVF, the IRA, you had a bunch of other smaller paramilitary groups who put arms aside for the sake of peace. And I think really you've got to have the degree of trust there that the rebel groups will urge for democracy to happen. They will put aside their arms, they'll work together, they'll get around the table, they'll reconcile Syria, and they'll make it a better country in the process.
Well, I admire your optimism, although I've got to say, I think if we end up arming the rebels, we're just going to see those guns being shot at us. But thank you very much. Now, we're going a bit outside our usual coverage area, and we're going to Francis, who's in Italy. Hello, Francis.
Yeah, I do not remember. Yeah, I called because I followed the show from the internet, yes.
Oh, wonderful. So, what's your take on the situation in Syria?
I am not sure that we have still full evidence on the subject, on the gas attack, but I feel that that Syria has been devolving quicker and quicker into a proxy war. Like one journalist said today, many people, and I talk as a leftist, have been blaming the West while not considering that even Russia or Iran have both been having part in this war. Talking about what Britain, what the US should do, they should probably start to avoid putting more gasoline on the fire, if you understand what I mean. We're having Turkey at the moment hindering the efforts against Assad and against ISIS by attacking the People's Protection Units in Rojava. I do not think the US and the UK, as the head of NATO, should allow this infighting. Other than that, I believe that if the airstrike should have been avoided, because we didn't have evidence that in those facilities were stored chemicals. As I said, if they are being concealed in school and so on, it is just better to try to get some aid and boots on the ground with the rebels, as Alex has said before me.
Well, I can certainly see the point of view that says that we won't be able to know for sure whether the strikes were particularly effective, because as you say, it's believed that the Assad regime hides most of their stocks in civilian targets to make it impossible to airstrike them. But at the same time, isn't it worth doing something simply so that we can try and denormalize the use of chemical attacks? If we let it go unpunished like we did in the past, aren't we at a risk of chemical attacks becoming more prevalent because dictators will know that we won't do anything about it?
Well, I think this is still like, it's not about chemical attacks in general. Like another chemical attack has happened, for example, in Gaza with the green gas. I'm not comparing the two because, of course, the green gas was nothing. It didn't cause that. It causes widespread suffering, and Israel deserves to be condemned. but not at Assad, like at Assad's levels. But yeah, you raise a fair question about whether Assad should do anything about it. I mean, whether the West should do anything about Assad. So I do not know exactly if I can answer you properly, or if so, will serve to discourage other nations from using chemical weapons. I don't see clear links there, but I can see your point.
So you talked about evidence. Is this evidence that that the chemical weapons were being stored at the targeted facilities, or is this evidence that Assad was behind the attacks?
Both, even if the first point, if the chemical weapons were developed and stored at those facilities, probably the more important, because it's relative, knowing that Assad has done other things similar nature in the past, and as far as I know, we have evidence about the previous attacks, even if I should look that up myself.
Yeah, there's certainly a pattern of behaviour here. I mean, as I understand it, the evidence that we had, or at least the evidence we're aware of, is mostly eyewitnesses from white hats there, as well as various civilians and aid groups. And the white hats are effectively a Western-backed aid and support group, rather like combat engineers, who are there to try and help in the situation. Although whether we can entirely trust eyewitnesses ever is a fair question, although in a war zone it's very difficult to get the evidence we need. But thank you, Francis. Some very interesting points there. Please do call again. So our last caller for this afternoon before we go to the news is Tom from East London. Tom, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Twisted. I'd just like to say it's clear from this week that we are now living in a dictatorship.
Oh?
The Prime Minister bombing other countries without even talking to our elected representatives. It's madness, and all your callers praising him, you know, that Magnus from Worcestershire, oh, he's so far up the Prime Minister's backside, it's incredible. And people like you in the media, just, you know, you're trying to trick us all into thinking we live in a democracy. Well, we're not. It's clear the Prime Minister will just do whatever he wants, and he can get away with it.
Well, at the same time, it's within the powers of the executive to engage in warfare. And in fact, the job of Parliament is scrutiny of the executive, not necessarily assent. While there is some degree of assent precedent, it's not constitutionally required to seek assent for military strikes because that's an exercise in Crown prerogative.
It's nonsense, utter nonsense. You know, Cameron went to Parliament about Libya. Blair went to Parliament about Iraq. We've had votes about Syria. We voted against it, right? But the Prime Minister decided to do it because he knew he'd lose.
Interesting. So do you think the Labour MPs wouldn't have backed the government's plan then?
Oh, I think they're all in bed together. I think they've betrayed the working classes, and I think they are just sleepwalking, doing whatever they want to get a bit of power. Whatever the Prime Minister wants them to do, they'll do it.
So how do we deal with Syria then?
I don't know. Anything that has to be decided, has to be decided by Parliament, okay? The people we elect. Not some guy sitting in Downing Street deciding what we do, okay? And we shouldn't just be going bombing the place, okay? I don't think it'll make a difference. And I think we're just riling up the world. I think we are just doing what President Trump says we should do, that lunatic over in the White House.
Well, I'm gonna have to leave it there, but Leafy, you've had praise and you've had criticism this afternoon. You're listening to mLBC, leading MHoC's conversation. Time for the news with Red Wolf.
The Northern Irish Executive has collapsed following the defection of the Sinn Féin MLA Trevism from the Left Bloc to the Labour Party. So far, 4 candidates have put themselves forth for First Minister from the UUP, Sinn Féin, Alliance and the SDLP. Prime Minister LeafyEmerald announced to the House that the UK had launched missile strikes against Syria. In a speech to the House of Commons, the PM said that the strikes targeted Assad's chemical weapons program in conjunction with similar strikes by the United States and France. The Prime Minister also assured the House that the UK would not step into the conflict in Syria any further, declaring, "These strikes are not about regime change. It is not about intervening in the civil war." The leader of the Labour Party, MHoC, won re-election for that post in an unopposed contest, but has won by only 3 votes against reopened nominations. Labour's deputy leader, Elliot C99, was briefly removed from the party while an internal investigation looked into claims that he encouraged people to vote against MHoC while also running the election. In the LBC market, sales of dark fruits have risen by 12%, with the Strongbow Company putting out a statement saying that they are very ashamed of their customers. The salt index is trading down 5 points, and the pound buys 1 meme 42 and 822 nub coins.